Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History Christmas Special 2019. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session. Before I go any further, as I do every time this year, I want to wish all of you listening at home a very happy holiday. Certainly a very Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas as a religious and or a special time of year to spend with family and loved ones. I wish you all the best of this 2019 holiday season. If I sound a little bit rusty here, it's because it's been a little while since I've actually been able to record a new episode of Comics and History. And just peeling the curtain back even further, I won't tell you exactly when I'm recording this episode, but it is well in advance of Christmas. It is still quite warm out from my perspective, but I anticipate that the last 3 months have been quite busy for myself and for my family as my little Victoria enters school. She's in a diagnostic kindergarten program, and I'm sure if I listen back to this recording, I'll be chuckling and saying, yeah, the first 12 weeks have been quite an adventure for my little girl as she's navigating her way through the daily grind of school. And so that no doubt has been keeping me away from recording as many new episodes of Comics and History as I would like. But I'm certainly hoping that I've been able to come over the airwaves at least once a month leading up to this Christmas special. I certainly love recording this show and sharing my thoughts, my memories about comics characters and storylines from yesteryear with all of you. So, with that out of the way, let's get started with the 2019 edition of the Christmas special. As advertised some time ago, I am reviewing a rather interesting Christmas-themed issue on this year's special. I'm looking at issue number 26 of The Spectre, written by John Ostrander, with guest artist John Ridgway in place of Mr. Ostrander's usual art partner, Tom Mandrake. There's a beautiful painted cover by Lou Harrison, and let me just go back and find the rest of the creative credits because I want to make sure everybody gets their due for this magnificent issue of The Spectre. Of course, I reviewed the entirety of the Ostrander Mandrake run on The Spectre on Comics and History, and I gushed about it, and I made sure to reread this particular issue before hitting the microphone now. But of course, I've gone on at length about how wonderful a run that was. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to my review of the John Ostrander, Tom Mandrake run on The Spectre, please do yourself a favor and check out the archives for Comics and History for that episode. Here we go. John Ostrander, writer John Ridgway, the guest artist Todd Klein, letterer Carla Feeney, colorist, Digital Chameleon, color separations, Pete Tomasi, assistant editor, and Dan Raspler, here credited as the Grinch, but normally the editor of this book. Just a reminder that Mr. Tomasi was often given the task or actually I'd say always given the task of handling the letters to the editor and responding to those letters in the back page each month for the Spectre. Now, of course, I did talk about the opening act of issue 26 of the Spectre when I was reviewing the Ostrander Mandrake run on the Spectre, but I want to recall after talking about the initial 3 or 4 pages of this issue, I kindly asked all of you to hang on until the Christmas special came out, and then I'll talk about the main part of the story at length. And so that's what I am going to do here. I'm going to begin with synopsis, spoiler-filled synopsis, I should say, of this issue, and then I'll get into my analysis of this issue and tell you folks why I really enjoy this story. Just in general, the knock that most Christmas-themed comics issues get is that they're seen as rather disposable, standalone issues which take both the creative team as well as the readers out of the regular goings-on in the title. Some might be so cynical as to say, well, of course, the Christmas issue gives the creative team time to take a break if they're running low on ideas, or if an arc isn't quite going the way they want it to, they can step away from it for a time. And so we can always look forward to a February cover dated issue, just to be a simple Christmassy themed story, and we can flip through it and say, oh, okay, that was kind of neat, kind of cheesy, and well, just wait another 30 days for next issue. I think that's unfair, though, folks. I've read a fair number of Christmas-themed issues over the years, of course, primarily from DC Comics. And yes, some of them really are stories that are meant to be enjoyed around Christmas time. They may not read so well in the summer. And yes, they don't really tie in to the current story arc that may be playing out in the book. But still, they're fun to read, and it helps to remind us that these characters are operating in a world where there are different religious faiths and where people do celebrate different religious holidays. And it's an opportunity for heroes to partake in the holiday season. And what really makes issue 26 of the Spectre, cover dated February of 1995, is that it's not entirely a standalone issue. Certainly not given the contents of the opening pages of this story. They certainly tie in to what was going on in the Spectre book at this time. But just in terms of the main story itself, it still reads very much like a traditional Ostrander-written Spectre title. At the end, yeah, it may seem a little bit different from what Ostrander normally presented us with, but it still fits in very much with what Mr. Ostrander was doing with the character throughout his run. And so I do see this issue as an important part of this volume of the Spectre, and it's certainly one which should not be read in just 5 minutes and then disposed of. This is at least the second time that I have read this particular issue. I've never read it. Wow, why am I stuck on that? I've never read this issue around Christmas time, and yet I still get a lot out of it. So I should stop gushing so that I'm not competing against the clock near the end. So let's get into that spoiler-filled synopsis of The Spectre, Volume 26. I've already gone through the creative credits. Just a reminder for folks who already listened to my look at the Ostrander Mandrake Spectre, John Ridgway was called in more often than not as a guest artist during those times when Mr. Mandrake was not able to produce the art for a particular issue of the Spectre. And I do have to say that Mr. Tomasi and Ostrander were very quick to assure fans that it wasn't a case of Mr. Mandrake losing interest or potentially being assigned to another character. It often came down to tight timelines and the script not getting to Mr. Mandrake in time to produce the art. So John Ridgway was often called in, and he's certainly not what you would call a clone of Tom Mandrake, but he's an artist whose work is really great, and the way he presented his art during his times as a guest artist here, it really fit in with what Mr. Mandrake was doing. There were often times where I'd be reading stories featuring his art here on the Spectre, and I'd have to stop and say, oh yeah, it's not Mr. Mandrake producing the art here. It's Mr. Ridgway, but it's still really good, and it doesn't interrupt the flow of the series at all. Not quite familiar with the painter, Mr. Harrison, who produced this brilliant cover of the Spectre riding a sleigh that's being propelled by two skeletal reindeer. But, it absolutely fits for this. You certainly wouldn't see the Spectre riding along with Santa in his sleigh with his very much alive reindeer led by Rudolph. Of course, the Spectre would be riding this beautiful red sleigh that still has these two rather macabre skeletal reindeer in front. I just love the commanding look on the Spectre's face. A beautiful blue, two-tone blue and white background here just gives a very ethereal look, and just it tells you that this is not your traditional run-of-the-mill Christmas-themed DC comic story. This issue was titled The Door of the Solstice, and in the opening pages, Jim Corrigan is speaking with his friend and mentor, Father Richard Kramer, who was recently threatened by an old enemy of the Spectre's, Asmodeus. And Jim recalls that when he first fought Asmodeus, it was shortly after World War II, and they had this great battle which raged back and forth between reality and limbo, and it ended when Asmodeus hit the Spectre with the spell of psychic amnesia. Fortunately for the Spectre, the spell also affected Asmodeus. And in the case of the Spectre, his ghost goop, as Jim calls it, or ectoplasm, condensed. It hardened and took on the form of Jim Corrigan's body. And the same thing happened to Asmodeus. He took on human form. Corrigan then goes on to explain that he forgot that he had died and that he had been transformed into the Spectre. And so for 20 years, he continued his career as a cop. And this provides one of several reasons as to why over the years Jim Corrigan distanced himself from the rest of the JSA. In this case, he simply forgot that he had been the Spirit of Vengeance and a member of the JSA. And Jim explains that as part of the spell of psychic amnesia, he just didn't question